Kính thưa quý vị, vào ngày 10 tháng 7 năm 2010, Hội Cựu Chiến binh Hải quân USS Kirk FF1087 đã tổ chức buổi hội ngộ các cựu thủy thủ hội viên và thân hữu tại Springfield, Virginia. Nhân dịp buổi hội ngộ, cuốn phim The Lucky Few đã được trình chiếu mô tả lại việc chiến hạm USS Kirk, một trong những chiến hạm thuộc đệ thất hạm đội Task Force 76, đã tham dự vào công cuộc cứu người tị nạn Việt Nam tại Biển Đông vào thời điểm cuối tháng 4 năm 1975, khi Sài Gòn thất thủ và miền Nam lọt vào tay Cộng sản. Đây là một cuốn phim lịch sử dài 1 tiếng đồng hồ, được thực hiện bởi đạo diễn Jan Herman, là sử gia của Cơ quan Y tế Hoa Kỳ, Phòng Y khoa và Giải phẫu, và cũng là phụ tá đặc biệt của Bộ trưởng Hải quân Hoa Kỳ. Chương trình phỏng vấn và tìm hiểu được hân hạnh đóng góp vào cuốn phim tài liệu lịch sử này với các cuộc phỏng vấn đạo diễn Jan Herman, cựu hạm trưởng USS Kirk ông Jacobs, qua đó đã liên lạc được với phi công Chinook Nguyễn Văn Ba, người mà ông Herman muốn tìm kiếm. Thêm vào đó, chúng tôi cũng cung cấp cho cuốn phim một số hình ảnh trong cuộc hành trình tìm tự do vào tháng 4 năm 1975. Để nhìn lại cuộc hành trình tìm tự do của người Việt Nam vào tháng 4 năm 1975, kính mời quý vị cùng xem cuốn phim The Lucky Few.
During its 234-year history, the U.S. Navy's primary mission has been to support, train, and equip combat-ready naval forces capable of winning wars, deterring aggression, and maintaining freedom of the seas. The current maritime strategy adopted in 2007 shifted the Navy's focus from an offensive combat capability to an emphasis on counterterrorism, as well as preventing conflict by stressing humanitarian assistance. This aspect of the strategy is not new. The U.S. Navy has traditionally come to the rescue of ships in distress on the high seas and providing assistance to the victims of natural disaster. Our current commitment in helping Haiti recover from a devastating earthquake is a case in point. In April 1975, the destroyer escort USS Kirk, whose mission to protect aircraft carriers from Soviet submarines, became involved in the tumultuous closing days of the Viet Nam War. As the North Vietnamese army closed in on Saigon, thousands of refugees fled in anything that would float or fly in order to seek refuge aboard one of the many U.S. Navy vessels cruising offshore. As swarms of South Vietnamese Army and Air Force helicopters, crammed with men, women, and children, sought the larger decks of carriers and amphibious vessels, a number of smaller Hueys landed on Kirk's tiny flight deck. Instantly, officers and sailors trained as warriors transformed a man of war into a humanitarian assistance ship. People who had lost everything, including their nation, found comfort, sustenance, and medical care. Desperation and anguish gave way to reassurance as crew members fed their unexpected guests, dispensed medical care, diapered infants, set up awnings to protect the refugees from a blazing sun, and provided hope to a dispirited people. This film tells the story of USS Kirk and its crew during wartime chaos. You will see both an extraordinary, though not unusual, example of what the United States Navy and Navy medicine do best.
When I looked at my old birth documents, I remember seeing Kirk on there and questioning her. You know, why was Kirk, a boy's name, included in my name? And she told me the story of the USS Kirk.
The final ground and artillery attack on the Ton Son Nhut Air Base began on April 28, 1975 at 4 a.m. Early reports from the airport indicated that communist rockets had completely cratered the tarmac, making all runways unusable. The still dark sky was lit with muzzle flashes and explosions. At dawn, from different locations around Saigon, many could see and hear that the attack on Tan Son Nhut had started, and Saigon was about to fall.
The communists attacked with shelling, mortar shelling and rockets raining on the base. And my unit compound, it was just about stone throw away from the air base. So we saw the firestorm.
And we drove through Saigon, and it was just chaos. And we're looting and drinking and raping and shooting going on throughout the city. I looked up and saw a Vietnamese Air Force C-130, which had been hit by a missile, trailing smoke and circling down, crashing.
Panic and hysteria now ruled the streets of South Vietnam's capital as the North Vietnamese army surrounded the city. Those Americans still there and Vietnamese who had worked for them sought refuge on any helicopter heading out to sea, where a U.S. Navy 7th Fleet Task Force awaited them. The helicopter evacuation known as Operation Frequent Wind had begun, and the final act of the Vietnam War was at hand. The destroyer escort USS Kirk was operating with 7th Fleet Task Force 76 off the South Vietnamese coast near the port of Vung Tau as large CH-53 Sea Stallions and CH-46 Sea Knights began shuttling American and Vietnamese evacuees from Saigon. Just as suddenly, hordes of unknown contacts began fogging Kirk's radar screens in her Combat Information Center. South Vietnamese Army and Air Force UH-1 Hueys, packed with fleeing refugees, were following the American aircraft out to sea. Operations Specialist Second Class James Bongard was glued to his radar screen in Kirk's Combat Information Center.
And all of a sudden, these dots come racing out. Dots across the radar screen are really just coming across. They're too fast to even mark. You're going, what are these things? You know, we're calling up the bridge asking for visuals, and they say, well, we got helicopters coming in, and there were just swarms of them. They'd come in waves.
Airman Donald Cox, with Kirk's anti-submarine Lamps helicopter detachment, and the ship's chief engineer, Lieutenant Hugh Doyle, recognized what was happening.
We knew that an evacuation was going on, and with each helicopter that would pass us, we had an open deck.
Put yourself in the position of being a young Vietnamese helicopter pilot. And you've got your family here, and 3 or 4 of your friends here, and a helicopter full of fuel right there. You know, it doesn't take a genius to put all that together, throw them in, take off, and head east.
Doyle and many of the other crew members were caught up in the excitement and saw the possibilities.
We had this relatively small flight deck, and never anticipated a helicopter landing on us, but we started talking about it. Wouldn't it be great to grab a helicopter? Wouldn't it be great?
In an attempt to advertise Kirk's hospitality, the ship's first-class storekeeper, who spoke rudimentary Vietnamese, began broadcasting on the air distress frequency. Ship 1087, land here. 20 minutes later, Airman Gerald McClelland waved the first Huey onto Kirk's flight deck with a load of refugees who were disarmed as they left the aircraft. Another helicopter, packed with desperate people, then approached and landed a few moments later, but was aboard just long enough for its passengers to disembark before Kirk had to prepare for another helicopter. Doyle recalls looking up and seeing 3 more aircraft.
You could see them at various levels, all on what they call short final, all waiting to land. This was the momentous decision that, which I believe was Captain Jacobs alone, and it was a very quick one. What do we do? And I don't know what went through his mind, but I can imagine his concern was looking up there and seeing that there were probably a dozen or more people on each one of those helicopters, and he's looking at 50 people, the lives of 50 people stacked up waiting for our single flight deck. So he said, over the side. So the second helicopter went over the side, and in short order, bang, 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 they started landing.
So as they were landing, we dropped the nets down on one side and began pushing the helicopters over. It didn't matter if you were enlisted or officer. Everybody lent a hand.
On our flight deck is a non-skid surface, so our helicopter had rubber wheels, but the Hueys had skids, metal skids, and it was like sandpaper. And they were very hard to move. It'd take 20, 30 guys, and we would just, everyone grab a hold of the helicopter, move it from side to side, and kind of wiggle it until we got it over close to the edge of the ship. And we just keep wiggling it till the skids got off the side of the ship, and the weight of the helicopter on the edge of the ship would break the skid, and it would just start nosing over, and everybody'd shove on the tail, and it would flip over.
So you push the helicopter, and then it would sit on over to the edge, and as it went over more and more, it would finally fall over, flip over on its back normally, and just lay there for, maybe 15, 20 seconds as it slowly submerged.
You could hear the helicopters coming, and it got louder and louder as they got closer. And as they approached, you could see the people in them. They were just crammed in as tight as you could get.
You could tell that they were scared. They were almost in shock as you look at their faces. The children were, of course, crying and scared. The women were just following along and basically would do whatever was needed. The men were trying to protect their families.
And as the refugees came on board, and each helicopter could have brought 10, 15, 20 more refugees, the people were brought in, and we were keeping them on the open areas of the ship, letting the people sit and rest. Well, it was hot up there, and so the crew set up tarps and awnings and things like this so that we could put the people in shade.
Up to that point, our mission was anti-air warfare. We were supposed to picket, run a picket line back and forth, be prepared to defend against North Vietnamese aircraft that would try to intervene in the evacuation. We were concerned about small boats, perhaps, so that we were still thinking shooting. We were still thinking weapons. We were still thinking, how are we going to take out that boat or that aircraft? As soon as that first helicopter landed, though, it all changed because there were women and children aboard.
From far off, the sound of a helo grew louder, portending another emergency landing. But as the aircraft appeared, Kirk's sailors grew apprehensive. This was not a Huey, but a twin-rotor CH-47 Chinook, the largest helicopter in the South Vietnamese inventory. As sailors aboard Kirk tried to quickly figure out a solution, the South Vietnamese pilot, his family, and passengers aboard the Chinook looked to end their journey that began early that morning in a residential neighborhood in Saigon.
I remember in the morning hearing a helicopter come. Grew up hearing helicopters, hearing Hueys and Chinooks. So the sound is very distinguishable, especially the sound of the Chinook, boom, 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 you know, coming towards the house, and the sound getting louder and louder.
I hear the noise from the helicopter. Chinook flew. My husband flew around the house a couple of times. So he landed on the soccer field in the front of my mother-in-law's house.
Wind, dust, newspaper flying just everywhere, chaos pretty much. Right in the front yard. I remember my mom running around trying to get my brother and sister. Myself, I was a bit older, 6.5, so I knew where all the excitement was, so everything was on the front of the house. At the same time, all of my dad's younger brothers and sisters were standing around, surprised as well as everybody was, surprised to see my dad land a helicopter there, pop open the door. I think the co-pilot came out waving at us. It was a Wild West, and every man for himself, basically. In this case, instead of you and your horse, you had you and your Chinook.
So we have 3 children. My older son, Mickey, about 6.5 years old. My second son, Mika, he 3.5 years old. And my youngest daughter, just about 10, 11 months. So everyone on the house, we all get ready, then hurry to get on the Chinook helicopter.
We were to grab our bag, get everything ready, and get on that helicopter. This was basically our chance, our ride out of the war.
My husband flew on the left side. My son, second son, sleep on the floor, and my daughter on my hand, so I have a handful.
You know, with my mom and dad, with my family, I felt safe. My mom would tell a different story. For her, I'm very frightful, but for a young 6.5-year-old boy, it was a sense of adventure, and one that, you know, for me, will always sear in my memory as the epic moment. We call it the epic moment in our family. He said, you know, let's give it a shot. We're going to head out to the Pacific Ocean. I'm hearing U.S. communication, U.S. Navy out there. Let's head in that direction, and let's see how this goes. And eventually saw on the distance the almighty USS Kirk as we know today.
Crew members frantically waved off the pilot, but he came around for another low pass. This time, there were anxious faces pressed against the helo's plexiglass portholes. Somehow, the pilot made it clear that he would hover the aircraft over Kirk's fantail so his family and passengers could jump to the deck.
Our pilots were back there and visually waving him off because he made his first approach as if to land on the flight deck. He was much too big for the flight deck. His rotors would have impacted the ship, catastrophic if he had tried to land.
Mindful of his precious cargo and urgent mission, Nguyen motioned for his co-pilot to open the co-pilot's right-hand door. Lieutenant Commander Richard McKenna, Kirk's executive officer, called for volunteers. Their task would be dangerous. Stand beneath this massive bird with its powerful downwash, trusting its pilot to maintain his position, and then catch or at least break the fall of the passengers as they jumped.
McKenna was taking volunteers, and once we found out what we were doing, it was shocking yet surprising, but we were still anxious to help. With the big CH-47, there was no way he was going to land on our flight deck.
Nguyen coaxed the helo perpendicularly across Kirk's fantail, cockpit port, and tail starboard, conscious of his aircraft's rotors. He had to maintain enough height for the rotors to clear the flight deck, yet get low enough to the fantail deck for the passengers to jump from the right door with minimal chance of serious injury. Below the howling rotor-induced hurricane, Kirk's sailors awaited the outcome.
He was 10 to 12, maybe 15 foot above the deck, and that's when the door opened.
You remember the door opening up and loud, just that, you know, you're right underneath the Chinook rotor, so it's very, very loud.
When my husband flew the Chinook helicopter, he told the co-pilot, go on the back and see if everything okay. Then I point the finger, I said, oh, my son there, so I need help. Then he helped my son, he dropped down. Then he jumped down. So after that, I dropped my daughter down.
And I looked up. As I looked up, I wasn't sure exactly what was going to happen, but all of a sudden, here comes a human. It was a baby.
I saw some crewmen down there catch.
There was no way I was going to let that baby hit the deck.
When I jumped down, I see the sailors, 2, 3 of them catch me.
And I caught a young woman, and she didn't hit the deck either.
I quickly followed her down, and as I got toward the edge of the door, and the door opened up, edge of the door, looking down, several crewmen, 3 or 4, I believe, you know, all of them with their hands raising high. stretching out, and my left arm holding on to a rope, and eventually dropping, letting go, and hoping that the crewmen down here would catch me. They did, and it was a happy moment. And it's, I would say that's a first step upon freedom, on stepping on the deck of the USS Kirk.
In the pilot's seat, Nguyen now prepared to execute a maneuver he had never anticipated, ditching at sea. Ba flew a safe distance to starboard of Kirk, and then, using the helicopter's cyclic control between his knees, he eased the helo's 6 tires just feet above the water. With the cyclic control force trim turned on, he was able to keep the huge aircraft in a stable hover while he removed his holstered pistol and struggled out of his flight suit. He then swung the emergency handle on the Chinook's left side door forward 90 degrees, and the panel dropped into the sea. It was now or never. Nguyen depressed the thumb button atop the cyclic, moved the cyclic to the far right, then released the button. As the Chinook suddenly jumped right, Nguyen leaped from the left door into the water, struggling to thrust his body beneath the surface to escape the rotor blades. Unwanted buoyancy forced him back to the surface. In its death throes, the helicopter resembled a whining, angry beast as its rotors exploded in a fury of hurtling shards.
It was a massive explosion. The rotors went flying off. We were scared because we thought, they might come back toward the ship.
As the helicopter hit the water, I pulled the hatch shut to protect us from any shrapnel that might come off exploding engines and such. And then as I watched the aircraft settle into the water and explode, I swung the door open, and before I could get to the rail to jump into the water, bodies of our Kirk crewmen are jumping into the water. They had taken their shoes off and then jumped fully clothed into the water, and it was just raining people in to save this little man that was floating in the water. The helicopter had almost settled directly on top of him. And our motor whaleboat was racing out to find him.
The helicopter then inverted and sat there for the longest period of time, maybe another 10 minutes, with just the 4 wheels showing above the water in a huge pool of red hydraulic fluid. It was kind of an eerie looking thing.
I'm a Texas boy, so it reminded me of a dead armadillo. You could just see the 4 little wheels sticking out like a dead armadillo laying there on its back. It was just in the water and the 4 tires sticking out, and it started sinking, and our little motor whaleboat went over and picked the pilot up.
Despite the happy outcome, no deaths and no serious injuries, the frenzied helicopter activity continued. Before 8 that night, 8 more South Vietnamese helicopters landed on Kirk's busy flight deck for a total of 13 that day. During the early morning hours of the following day, April 30th, Kirk rescued 2 downed Marine pilots whose helicopter had run out of fuel. Despite the excitement of the rescue, things remained fairly quiet until almost noon, when the ship rendezvoused with SS Greenport and transferred its refugees to the larger vessel. For now, at least, Kirk was without refugees. At 9:30 that night, after receiving a cryptic message from the task force commander, Kirk's commanding officer, Commander Paul Jacobs, dispatched a motor whaleboat to the Joint Task Force flagship USS Blue Ridge to pick up a mysterious civilian passenger.
When the CEO gets a message from the 7th Fleet himself, would like to speak to you, come alongside, he gets your attention. So I thought maybe we had done something wrong, not realizing we were being picked for a special mission.
He said to me, I'm not used to having armed civilians come aboard the ship in the dead of night. And I said, I'm not used to coming aboard armed in the dead of night, but, I've got a job to do. I work for the Secretary of Defense.
He says, we're going to go back to try to rescue the Vietnamese Navy. which is, if they don't, they're going to be slaughtered.
The next chapter of USS Kirk's adventure was about to begin. Planning for the new mission had actually begun several days earlier in an office at the South Vietnamese Navy headquarters on the Saigon River. By then, the city's fate had all but been sealed by the arrival of the North Vietnamese Army. At Navy headquarters, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations Captain Kim Do met with his old friend, Rich Armitage. The two had worked together on many missions during the war.
I was desperate, and all of a sudden when I heard him on the phone, I knew that that is a good help I'm going to get. But at first I thought at least for me. But when he told me about that he want to meet with me at my office, and he came right after that, about half an hour later, we discussed about the plan to get the fleet out, not to let the fleet in the hand of the communists when he took over.
I told Captain Kim and other officials of the Vietnamese Navy that rather than leaving on the 3rd or 4th of May, which was our original plan, we'd have to effect the evacuation that evening, the 29th, and that I'd meet them in Con Son Island.
Con Son Island is the only spot to get as many ships together. It was close to most of our unit, either from Saigon or from the Mekong River. Also, our people are very familiar with that island. It had a very well sheltered bay.
We had not made arrangements for this, but they should take all capital ships that they didn't destroy to Con Son Island and put as many people on as possible. And I went back to Tasajin, got a helo out to the Blue Ridge, and started to effect the plan. I showed up on the Blue Ridge. I had nothing. I had no wallet, I had no passport, I had no identification, I had a weapon. And I looked around as I came off the helo and I saw the flag lieutenant. And I said, Lieutenant, this is going to be hard to believe, but I'm on a mission from the Secretary of Defense, and I need to speak to Admiral Whitmire.
Now Armitage, an agent for the Secretary of Defense, was aboard Kirk, and he was calling the shots. Kirk changed course immediately to Con Son Island, about 115 miles southwest of Vung Tau. It was Wednesday, April 30th, 1975.
Somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, pull the chart for Con Son Island. I said, where the heck is Con Son Island? He said, we're going down there to do something according to what Captain Jacobs says. I said, well, who else is going with us? He said, we're coming down alone.
We sailed what was left of the night, and as dawn broke, we were around Con Son Island, and there, as dawn broke, you saw just what was a wonderful sight to my eyes. You saw scores of Vietnamese ships and an awful lot of people on board them. And they were waiting there, as Captain Kim and I had discussed 24 hours before.
They were all just floating out there across the horizon. Then I knew we had gotten to the point that this was our rendezvous. It was quite impressive to see a parking lot full of ships.
As we approached it, we could see their fleet there. So they were just milling around dead in the water. Some of them were anchored, some of them were not. They were adrift. And you could look over there and see the people on the ship loaded to people all the way up to the bridge. They've been out there for a week or so with no water, no food. And this is going to be an insurmountable problem. Internal to me, I said, oh my God, how are we going to pull this off?
I carry around in my head the number 29 or 30 ships and about 31,000 people on board them. So the Kirk for me was ideal. They could communicate with the rest of the U.S. fleet. They would go with us across to the Philippines to be able to rescue any of the folks that might be in harm's way. Some had been wounded, some were pregnant, all were sick after a while, and I needed some way to take care of those folks. And the Kirk for me was perfect.
I got on the 1MC and briefed the crew what we were going to be doing. And it's going to be purely humanitarian. How are we going to help these 30,000 people get out of a war-torn country into a safe place, and maybe they could transition to the United States. That crew was very special. I could ask that crew to do anything, and they would do it.
Look, they're GIs, and GIs are used to making chicken salad out of you-know-what. And they did just that. If there's one thing that a U.S. service member, and certainly a member of the U.S. Navy, can do, that is to adapt to changing situations. And I thought they took to the role like a fish to water.
Our job was to kind of corral them, shuffle them around, get them into various positions. And we put Mr. Armitage at that point, we transferred him to the Vietnamese flagship. In the meantime, we put our boats in the water, and we went with our hospital corpsman, Chief Burwinkle. We went kind of from ship to ship to see what the situation was.
We sent our enginemen, electricians, machinist mates, a lot of the engineering technical people over to get the ship started. And they would go from one ship to the next one, getting them started.
Many vessels that left Vietnam jammed with refugees were barely seaworthy.
Some of these vessels had taken hits coming down the Saigon River. I do remember one LSM that was sinking. We pulled alongside of it in the HQ3 and took people off. And you did it by, you're at sea and put a wooden plank, which people were to walk off the sinking ship one at a time. And one sailor on the sinking ship panicked and kind of rushed across the plank and pushed, as I recall, a younger girl who was also on the plank in between the two ships. Of course, she was crushed to death, and that sailor was shot to death by one of the people on the HQ3, which brought a good bit of order to the disembarkation from the sinking ship. And as I recall, once we had everyone off it, the Kirk then sunk it by gunfire.
Kirk's situation was anything but certain. How would the North Vietnamese victors react to the potential escape of what remained of the South Vietnamese Navy? The destroyer escort was well equipped to fight Soviet submarines, but virtually defenseless against hostile aircraft.
This country was now belonging to someone else. They had access to our aircraft. We were like sitting ducks. They could have taken the planes off and taken the Kirk out and all the Vietnamese ships. And we had no idea how they were going to react.
Fortunately, no hostile attack came, and the crew refocused its attention on the task at hand, aiding refugees.
We finally got underway, and how we actually determined the formation, it was a very long formation, probably 5 miles from van to the rear, and it was 2 columns, 16 ships in each column. 2 parallel columns, probably a mile apart, or a little less than that. And we proceeded east.
Kirk could steam only as fast as the slowest vessel in the convoy, a speed that would seldom exceed 5 knots.
And the entire idea of defending this convoy against attack just evaporated, and it became then taking the dock on house calls and delivering rice, delivering medicine.
Doc Burwinkle's responsibility for 30,000 or so Vietnamese was unheard of. And we kept track of him as best we could, keeping in touch with the ships as he was going from one to the other and back and forth. But he was such our beloved Doc that we all were concerned about him.
Chief Burwinkle was tireless. He was a country doctor making house calls, but he had 30,000 patients, and he didn't have a little Jeep to drive around, and he had a boat.
And we used it to steam up and down the columns of the Vietnamese ships. And I would go aboard ship and see what I could do as far as medical-wise to help these people out.
And sometimes we used an old decrepit swift boat. Sometimes it was our motor whaleboat, but it was Chief Burwinkle, and just going from ship to ship to ship, and he would spend hours just screening all sorts of problems. And how he did it is beyond me. He's a wonderful man, wonderful doctor, and he was absolutely what we needed at that time. He's not a doctor, of course. We call him Doc. He's a hospital corpsman. but he's an independent duty hospital corpsman, very capable. I would have anointed him doctor after we got into Subic just because of what he did.
Whatever he needed in the logistics train, from food, water, medical supplies, we'd bring it to him by whaleboat or gig or however it means we could get it to him. And he was up there on the front end of seeing the real live medical problems of these 30,000 people.
And these refugees, crowded together in tropical heat without adequate food and water, had their share of medical issues: dehydration, diarrhea, and conjunctivitis.
So I was very much afraid of that conjunctivitis spreading, because it is a very, very virulent illness. And if you've ever had pink eye, your eyes swell shut, you cannot see, and it's easily contaminated through your hands, touching your eyes, touching a handle, touching another person.
On the first day when we arrived down there, Doc Berwick went around with all his medical supplies, having sick call at each one of these ships. And then as we get them underway, he comes up to me and says, "Oh, by the way, Captain, now what do we do?" "Well, I have no medical supplies." So I said, "I'll get on the phone to 7th Fleet." And within a matter of hours, we had Air Force C-130s dropping 55-gallon drums in the water right alongside of our whaleboat. We were wrestling them into the boat, and that's how we got our medical supplies for the 30,000 people.
The Air Force sent out C-130s, and they dropped various supplies in barrels to me, basically dressings, eye ointment, anti-diarrheal medicine, and baby diapers, and formula.
As Chief Burwinkle and his assistant, Hospital Corpsman 3rd Class Falkenberg, continued their nautical rounds in the South China Sea, Kirk offered assistance to other vessels that required emergency repairs.
We got word that we were going to plot a course and pull alongside another ship. Usually you see another ship and you see one or two people outside. You just go about 500 yards off the ship and see the whole deck just covered with people. It's astounding.
So I figured, gee, if there's that many people we could see who are on deck, I figured below deck there had to be at least twice that number.
They were just thousands of people. As many as you could get on board. They were sitting, standing, they were just crammed on, just like the Hueys, They were just overloaded to the max.
I stepped outside and it was just overwhelmed with emotion, along with everybody else there. There was just thousands of people on top of this deck, and you're looking down at them, and I took a few pictures, and I just had to stop taking pictures. I felt bad about taking pictures. I can't really describe the look on these people's faces. They have that look about them. They're fleeing, so in one way they're happy, but in the other way they really don't know where they're going. It's sort of a blank, odd stare.
What these refugees had endured in escaping from their homeland could only be imagined by the crew members of USS Kirk. The reality was even more harrowing for some. 17-year-old Lon Tron was in her 9th month of pregnancy. As Saigon came under attack and descended into chaos, she became separated from her husband, an officer in the South Vietnamese Air Force. With her mother, she managed to find her way to the Saigon River and board a family-owned boat where many of her relatives had taken flight. After a hazardous voyage down the river, they reached the open sea.
When we got on the ocean for a few days, we entered to international water, and I saw a very, very big ship. And in my heart, I know this must be an American ship. They brought us food and water, and everyone was so grateful and happy because we knew we would survive and American would help us.
We had a lot of pregnant women in this fleet. Some of them were more pregnant than others, 7, 8, 9 months. So I said, "Doc, you better get them in one place." He said, "Well, let's put them on the Kirk there. I can deal with them early in the morning before I go do my rounds.
Aboard his commandeered swift boat, Chief Burwinkle moved among the columns of Vietnamese vessels seeking out near-term pregnant women. While on his search, the chief hospital corpsman encountered an English-speaking Vietnamese named Joseph Pham. Pham would prove to be a godsend as Kirk's very busy interpreter.
I raised my hand and they picked me and they said, okay, my wife is also pregnant. So from that time on, they took my wife and 4 other expectant mothers to be transferred to the Kirk.
Pham soon volunteered to accompany Chief Burwinkle on his rounds, where his language skills proved invaluable.
I would join Chief Burwinkle and his men and to bring water, medicine, and food to the refugee ship. And I know that there's not much food or supplies on the ship, but the sailors share what they have and what they could to provide help and give assistance to the refugees, which we were very thankful and we are touched by the gesture.
One day, Mr. Pham, the translator for U.S. Navy, he had come aboard the Vietnamese Navy ship and let us know Captain DịCH allowing anyone in need of medical, also including the pregnant woman, to board in U.S. Navy ship for further medical attention. They put me to the big room with other 4 pregnant women and their family, and they treat us very kindly and take good care of us. Captain DịCH ordered DịCH to take care of us. But all we knew was that DịCH come to our room every day, at least 3 times a day, to take us to the cafeteria for meal. And if we need anything else, he would get it for us.
Each morning, Captain Jacobs visited the pregnant women, and each morning he delivered a pep talk, encouraging them to get busy and start having their babies.
He always smiled. He told us he want at least 1 baby born on the ship and named after the USS Kirk.
Despite the captain's encouragement, none of the women gave birth at sea.
There was one lady who went into labor, but she stopped. And I remember Falkenberg, HM3 Falkenberg said, "Chief, what are we going to do if one of these ladies has a baby?" And I said, "Well, we're going to witness a miracle of birth." That was Falkenberg.
If the officers and men of USS Kirk would not witness the miracle of birth aboard their vessel, soon enough they would contend with the tragedy of loss.
We had a young boy who had pneumonia, and we figured out the pediatric dose, and he was basically cured of his pneumonia, pediatric dose for penicillin. And so he was basically cured. But unfortunately, in the act of feeding him, he coughed or somehow aspirated what his mother was feeding him, and he died.
He was there almost reached freedom, but he died. This was very tragic and very sad, and I felt very sorry for the family.
We all got dressed up in our formal uniforms and conducted a burial at sea at night. And it was profoundly emotional. All the crew members that were not on watch were back there. It was just well done. And I think the Vietnamese family really appreciated how we handled that situation.
We performed the service in the most professional manner that we could, us not having done it before, but if you would, following the directions of Captain Jacobs. And I'm playing taps. It really hit home. What these people were going through.
Despite the tragedy, the flotilla plodded steadily eastward across the South China Sea, a body of water not noted for its placidity. With each sunrise, both landsmen and experienced seafarers among the vessels noted the uncharacteristic calm.
The sea was calm as a lake. It was very, very mild, and that allowed us to work well with the ships. Some of the ships were not very seaworthy, and this allowed them to be able to transit. It also allowed the Kirk to continue to use its small boats in transferring people back and forth and materials back and forth. So it was a gift from God that we had such wonderful, wonderful conditions.
A miracle to have 7 days with flat sea. People live on the deck, openly on the deck. Thousands and thousands of people, and children, women, old people. If the sea was rough, it certainly would be a disaster.
Feeding and providing water to more than 30,000 refugees was too big a job for Kirk alone. Soon, other Navy vessels joined the flotilla to lend a hand and provide food and the temporary loan of several corpsmen, medical supplies, and tons of rice to Kirk.
The Mobile sent over tons, I'm sure it was tons of rice. We loaded up through the stern transom of our ship with the variable depth sonar, a whole working party full of bags and bags of rice that we were using for distribution to the ships that we were looking after.
During that first week of May, one busy day melded into the next as Kirk's gig and motor whaleboat shuttled back and forth among the fleet. Its crew delivered food and water. Chief Burwinkle held sick call, and engineers and machinists' mates repaired cranky diesel engines and bilge pumps. As the fleet finally approached Philippine territorial waters on Monday, May 5th, a diplomatic crisis developed, one that threatened the entire plan and the welfare of the refugees.
There was a problem of getting in Subic Bay because the communist government did object to our escape and asked the Filipino government to send back the fleet.
Negotiations went on for some time, with messages flying back and forth between the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet, the U.S. Embassy in Manila, and the State and Defense Departments in Washington. Finally, there was an agreement. Since most of the South Vietnamese vessels had once been U.S.-owned, they could be returned to U.S. ownership. Naval personnel, mostly from Kirk's crew, would board and disarm the vessels, replace South Vietnamese flags with United States flags, and take command. They would then enter Subic Bay as U.S. Navy ships.
South Vietnam had already fallen, and the Philippine government had officially recognized the communist government as the lawful government of Vietnam, all of Vietnam now. So the Vietnamese flag, the gold with the 3 horizontal red stripes, no longer had meaning to the Philippine government. Of course, it had infinite meaning to the Vietnamese refugees who were willing to die for that flag.
Shortly after 10 a.m. on May 6th, personnel transfers to the Vietnamese vessels began. By day's end, 39 of Kirk's personnel had been embarked aboard the ships, 9 officers and 30 enlisted.
So we rounded up 30 American flags from the cook and myself and several other ships there, and we put an officer in charge of every one of these ships.
Those LSTs that we had to disarm were full of weapons. It was incredible, the weapons aboard these ships. they all went into the South China Sea. We had to throw them over the side. So it was a very busy day and a half of disarming that fleet.
I was asked to deliver the orders to each of the ships, to each of the Americans on the ships, and then a flag, because we're going to have this reflagging ceremony.
A boat came by and delivered the packet with the American flag, and the ceremony was to be done with as much dignity as possible.
And a young officer came on board our ship and said that you have to lower the flag and hoist the American flag up and sail in. I asked him, I said that, we lost everything. We lost our pride, we lost our country, we lost our pride, we lost everything. But please, do a last favor or try to have a ceremony of down the flag and raise the flag up. A ceremony that would save us some face. And we have a very, very emotional ceremony. And all the people would flock to the deck, sing the national anthem, crying at the same time, to lower their flag, and then raise the American flag ceremoniously. So the dignity is there. So even though that it's a big loss for us, but at least it really saved our face and also our dignity.
It was kind of a feeling of finality in the fall. That was kind of the final step in the fact that South Vietnam no longer existed.
The ship was silent. There was no one speaking on the ship. It was absolutely quiet. Then as they were preparing to lower the South Vietnamese flag, in a cappella, the crew started singing the national anthem. It's a very moving time. It was as they slowly lowered the flag, and people singing, they saw their flag, maybe the last time ever they were going to be under their flag.
Here is one that I kept since then. The captain gave it to me. Very, very respectfully said, "Sir, keep that flag."
And then, in silence, the American flag was raised.
At 12:27 p.m. on Wednesday, May 7th, Kirk's log recorded a Filipino aircraft flying over to check the vessel's identification. 2 hours later, Kirk passed Grandee Island in Subic Bay, just under a mile to starboard.
There was an elation that went through the refugees, that they finally were safe, and that they had a new life ahead of them. And the new life was going to be much better than anything they could have imagined under the communist rule.
At 3 p.m., Kirk moored at Wharf West, port side to USS Benjamin Stoddard in Subic Bay, Republic of the Philippines, ending its 5-day, 1,000-mile odyssey across the South China Sea. For the officers and men of USS Kirk, those events of 35 years ago and their role in rescuing the South Vietnamese refugees have had a profound impact.
Our feelings about being there in Vietnam had changed significantly. We had gone to Vietnam with expectations of being in combat. We were prepared for it, we had trained for it, and that was the action that we were looking for. When we got there and found out that combat wasn't what was needed, it was a heart and a hand that was needed. We didn't recognize it at first, we just did our jobs. But it was after that we began to realize that our Vietnam experience was totally different than our brothers that had walked in the field in combat. We recognized that it was going to be a positive experience for the rest of our lives. We were there to save life, not to destroy it.
That 2-year period of my life on the Kirk is probably the highlight of my naval career. Most CEOs that get a chance to be commanding officer never get a chance to exercise their leadership under very stressful conditions. And one way you can say you were blessed, you were fortunate, or you were just God looked out after you. But that experience is so profound even today.
There wasn't a grumble or a complaint among the crew. The crew was giving up. In fact, some of them crew, they emptied their lockers of their clothing, gave away all their candy that they stored away for weeks. It was an amazing thing what the crew did. It really was.
Our job was humanitarian assistance, and we did it very well.
We were proud to be members, sailors of the USS Kirk.
Seeing the men, it was only men then, of the USS Kirk, and realizing how much a part of their life, what a great capstone this was to their careers, that moved me. That they could feel so good about their involvement in that rescue. I envied them. They weren't burdened with the former misadventure of Vietnam.
If I get depressed or think I'm having a bad day, I just remember the looks on these people's face, and I know there's nothing that can compare to what they went through.
The crew responded tremendously. I couldn't be more proud of a group of gentlemen, and I think they took great pride in helping these people when they realized the situation they were in. I mean, after all, we were going home, and we had a home to go to. They had just left their home and didn't know what was facing them in the future.
For the former citizens of South Vietnam, another chapter on their journey to freedom was about to begin.
I feel the crew on the Kirk, wonderful people. They are really a good hands for, rescue a lot of people, Vietnamese people, include my family. So thanks to the crew, Kirk member, to save us on that day.
We would always hear stories about what happened, not only with our own family, but with relatives and the other Vietnamese family that we met. So it's definitely such a unique experience that it's just complete gratitude, for what everyone did for our family.
I have good memory about USS Kirk crew member, from the ship captain to the youngest sailor, who have also their generous heart and gave us the best treatment possible. That's why I wanted to add Kirk is my daughter's middle name.
It's epic, because that's a major part of our story, a major part of my story that has now some form of a closure. That was for me, throughout all this, and the first sort of footstep to freedom.
Has been 34 years passed by, but we still think about it from time to time. But most of all, I will never forget the experience on USS Kirk and the crew member who have extend their hand to helping us during our time of need. And a frigate named USS Kirk has always been in my thought. And from the bottom of my heart, I would like to say thank you. Thank you for this wonderful country with wonderful people. May God protect you and your family, and God bless America.
You'll never forget the sound. I never forget the sound. And I hear a helicopter coming from miles and miles away, and I have an American flag I keep in my shop. And when I hear a helicopter come, I run out and grab my flag and wave at the flag. I don't know if they see it, but I want them to.